It is generally accepted that an airplane is one of the safest forms of transportation. However, there are still dreadful aviation disasters, some of which remain unexplained. After wreckage analysis, it often turns out that unforeseen human errors, bad weather, or mechanical failures were to blame. Yet sometimes entire planes disappear without a trace, never reaching their destination. There's nothing more terrifying than aviation disasters that defy logical explanation. From the flight of Canadian Pacific Airlines that literally vanished into thin air, to the plane that crashed into a mountain, the 15 biggest mysteries of world aviation. When it comes to unexplained aviation disasters, Egypt Air Flight 990 is one of the most controversial in history. And while no one has reached a consensus on the cause of the crash, there is plenty of evidence suggesting that this was another attempt at pilot revenge. Flight 990 departed from Los Angeles after a stop in New York, and it was the last time anyone saw or heard from any of the plane's passengers. About 30 minutes after Flight 990 reached an altitude of about 10 kilometers, it began to descend to half that height without any warning or signal. Authorities determined that during its fatal fall, the Boeing 767 reached the speed of sound, and although the plane stabilized momentarily, it disappeared from radars and crashed into the northern part of the Atlantic Ocean. Some believe that the plane could have fallen victim to the northern Bermuda Triangle. Egyptian authorities took control of the investigation and did not allow the FBI access. But when they claimed that a mechanical failure, which resulted in the deaths of all 217 people on board, was the cause of the crash, the world was not convinced. On the plane was a first officer who had recently been demoted. Also on that plane was the person who had demoted him. Some insider sources suggest that this was a nefarious plan for revenge, as evidenced by the first officer's last known phrase, which translates as, "I've had enough. I rely on God." In the 55 years since the crash of Aer Lingus Flight 712, we have never learned the true cause of the plane's fall into the sea near Tuskar Rock. To understand the scale of the destruction, it should be noted that Aer Lingus Flight 712 was a regular flight across the Irish Sea from Cork to Heathrow. And although such a flight was made countless times, the 61 passengers who boarded the plane never got to disembark. In those days, Irish winters were much harsher, and it was during the swan migration period. Today, this is one of the most popular theories explaining the cause of the tragic crash of Flight 712. However, it is also known that the plane flew through the territory of the UK's leading missile range, and many believe that it could well have been mistaken for a combat drone. The British warship HMS Penelope was also conducting exercises in the area. Despite this, the military categorically denies their guilt, but strangely enough, no one could explain why the ship's log mysteriously disappeared during that time. On the day of the flight, it was reported that the weather was perfect for a problem-free flight. Nevertheless, the last message received from the aircraft was 12,000 feet, descending, spinning rapidly. Immediately after this, another plane in the area was asked to descend to search for Flight 712, but it refused. The aircraft debris was found about 10 kilometers from Tuskar Rock. Unlike other airlines that stopped flights after such a disaster, Airlink continues to operate Flight 712 to this day. However, we have not found an answer to the question of what happened in this terrible aviation disaster. Plane crashes are not so rare, but even less common is a massive cargo plane like the Boeing 707 vanishing from the face of the Earth, leaving not a single piece of debris. Such is the story of the mysterious disappearance of Varig Flight 976, which was heading to Los Angeles from Tokyo, but failed to pass the second scheduled check 482 kilometers off the Japanese coast, the last known location of the plane. However, there are a few very strange coincidences that make this disappearance very suspicious. The plane was piloted by 55-year-old Brazilian Captain Gilberto Araujo da Silva, who at that time was one of the most experienced and qualified pilots and even survived one crash landing of a Boeing. The second oddity is that the plane was carrying cargo, 50 paintings by Japanese artist Manabu Mabe, valued at more than $1 million. There were no distress signals, messages, unusual activity, plane debris, or traces of the crew, so it seems as if the plane literally dissolved in the air. Could this have been a major art theft? This, and many other theories today, surround the aviation mystery of Varig Flight 967. Among them is the theory that the plane accidentally entered Soviet airspace and was shot down. However, this seems unlikely, as there were no messages or calls from the plane. Perhaps as a result of a sudden decompression, everyone inside lost consciousness, after which the plane fell into the Pacific Ocean. However, the entire surrounding area was thoroughly searched, and not a single piece of wreckage was ever found. Where the plane is now, and what happened to it, remains one of the most strange and puzzling questions in aviation, to which we still can't find an answer. Some people are afraid to embark on very long flights, fearing difficulties en route, but even the shortest trips do not guarantee safe travel. This was proven by the third deadliest aviation disaster in Indonesia's history, the crashed AirAsia Flight 8501, which instead of reaching its destination in Singapore, a mere 2-hour flight from Indonesia, plunged into the grave of the seabed. A complex international search and rescue operation was launched, but hopes of finding any survivors quickly dwindled. The aircraft, carrying 162 people, had flown for about 40 minutes when severe weather set in over the Java Sea, and it requested a course deviation to avoid the storm. But before communication could be established with it, it disappeared from the radars. Strangely, a distress signal was never received, and the plane seemed to simply vanish. When the lengthy search operation was finally concluded, only 116 bodies of the deceased were found, and it was presumed that the plane's wreckage had sunk to the bottom of the ocean. It is now believed that a non-critical fault in the rudder control system prompted the captain to reset the flight control computers. But this failed, and the pilots lost control of the aircraft. Miscommunication between the pilots may have contributed, but it seems that AirAsia Flight 8501 simply fell into a perfect storm of unfortunate coincidences that led to the crash. Despite the crew not issuing a distress signal, the black box recording proved that the pilots fought for control of the aircraft until the last moments of the flight. The disappearance of an entire plane and the absence of its debris is a sufficiently alarming occurrence. However, if classified materials are aboard the missing plane, it causes even more concern. In 1956, a B-47 Stratojet took off from an Air Force base in Florida, which was to make a non-stop flight to an airbase in Morocco. The first aerial refueling went without incident, but when it was time for the second refueling over the Mediterranean Sea, the situation began to deteriorate. The tanker could not establish contact with the B-47, which was supposed to descend for refueling. Nobody knew where the plane had gone. Extensive searches were started for many kilometers around, but not a single piece of debris was ever found. There was also no evidence found that could give us an idea of what actually happened to the notorious B-47. However, widespread interest in the plane was sparked by the fact that there were 2 capsules with nuclear ammunition on board. This was key material for producing nuclear bombs, suggesting that the plane might have been detained by countries interested in its nuclear cargo. A plane with nuclear materials is the last thing that can vanish without a trace in the sky. But unfortunately, the Stratojet and its valuable cargo were lost forever, and we are still no closer to solving this astonishing aviation mystery. For the past 70 years, the story of the Stardust airplane remains one of the most shocking and terrifying unsolved mysteries of the aviation world. The passenger list of British South American Airlines Flight CS-59 traveling from Argentina to Chile could be a perfect plot for a detective story. What happened to this doomed flight adds even more mystery. On board were 2 businessmen friends touring South America, a Swiss and an English businessman. Among the passengers was also a Palestinian, whose jacket was rumored to be lined with diamonds, a well-known South American businessman, and a Chilean citizen who needed to return home from Germany. And finally, a British public servant with a rather diplomatic briefcase heading for the British embassy. The date was August 2nd. 1947. The flight was through dangerous mountains, but the pilot was very experienced, and the journey should have been within the capabilities of both him and the airplane. The aircraft should have been easily able to surpass even the highest mountain peaks. However, before landing, a mysterious message consisting of one word, Stendek, was received from the plane. It was repeated twice more, after which the plane disappeared. To explain why a massive search operation was initiated after the radio silence and the airplane's failure to arrive arrive at its destination. Aerial searches were carried out, and the Chilean and Argentine armies combed the entire territory on foot, but not a single trace of the plane was ever found. The mysterious message sparked many speculations. Some even believed that the craft could have been abducted by an alien spaceship. This is one of the biggest aviation mysteries to which we still have not found an answer. No one who was on board this plane has ever been found. When you're on a plane, you want to believe that it's being piloted by a captain for whom the safety of everyone on board is paramount, and this is usually taken for granted. Unfortunately, for the people on Kenya Airways Flight 507, this was not the case. A series of pilot errors, which no one could explain, led to one of the most horrific aviation disasters in history. After a calm flight from the Ivory Coast, 3 planes were waiting at the Cameroon airport to depart to Douala. However, due to stormy conditions, there was a delay that affected all the planes in the area, all except for the plane of 52-year-old Captain Francis Mbatia Wamwea, who decided to take off without any permits or clearances. When the plane climbed to a height of 300 meters without any visual landmarks, things started to go wrong. The autopilot did not engage, but none of the pilots noticed. Only when the plane began to bank heavily to the right did they realize that control was impossible. A struggle ensued to correct the situation, but ultimately the plane, out of control, crashed into a mangrove swamp, burying the unfortunate passengers under mud and water. None of the 108 passengers lived to the end of the tragic flight, and when the final report was published, the cause of the crash was attributed to a fatal pilot error. It is assumed that the cause of one of the most tragic and preventable aviation disasters in history was severe spatial disorientation of the pilot during the storm. From the dawn of aviation, accidents happened from time to time, but an entire plane disappearing without a trace is a rarity. This is precisely what happened with Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight 3505, which took off from Vancouver with 37 people on board, including crew members. The plane was heading for Tokyo, but sadly, never reached its first stop in Alaska. 45 minutes after the plane failed to show up at the arrival point, authorities were notified, and a large-scale search and rescue operation began. The most common theory was that the plane had crashed in the freezing north. However, after a massive search operation that lasted 3 months yielded no leads, the investigation into the cause of Flight 3505's crash was halted. The majority of the passengers on the plane were U.S. and Canadian military personnel, so this incident in early 1951 quickly drew the world's attention. What is strange is that absolutely no distress signals or other signs were received from the vessel. It seems like the plane simply vanished from the face of the earth. The bodies of those on the ill-fated plane were never found. To this day, this disaster remains one of the most horrifying and utterly inexplicable aviation incidents, the mystery of which we have not been able to solve. Do you have any guesses about the fate of this flight? Share your opinion in the comments. 50 years ago, over Czechoslovakia, a Yugoslav airliner DC-9 exploded with 28 passengers and crew on board, flying from Stockholm to Belgrade. The only survivor of this air disaster was Serbian stewardess Vesna Vulovic, who later entered the Guinness Book of Records as the only person to survive a fall from a height of over 10 kilometers. During the incident, Vesna was pinned by a food cart in the tail of the plane, and while the other people on board were being sucked out of the plane, she remained in the tail, which then landed in a dense forest on a snow-covered mountain slope. The soft snow blanket softened the landing so much that Vesna was able to survive the impact. It is believed that a bomb was planted inside the plane during a stopover in Copenhagen, but no specific evidence of where it came from or who planted it was ever found. When Vesna was taken to the hospital, she was in a coma for another 10 days. Despite a long list of injuries, a fractured skull, 2 crushed vertebrae, a broken pelvis, bone fractures, and both legs, she fully recovered. Now, Vesna jokes that like a cat, she has 9 lives, but she does not remember what happened. She returned to work at the airline. Unfortunately, Vesna is the only person who survived this disaster. To this day, it remains one of the most incredible aviation stories. Throughout the history of air travel, no mystery has puzzled and baffled us as much as the infamous Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, which took off on March 8, 2014, from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. What happened to the 227 passengers and 12 crew members remains one of the most tragic and unexplained mysteries in aviation. At the moment when the plane was supposed to enter Vietnamese airspace, the plane's transponder was turned off. The aircraft deviated from the set course and flew back towards the Malay Peninsula, where it eventually completely disappeared from the military radars tracking it. For several weeks after the tragedy, the whole world sought answers to numerous questions. The most likely assumption is that the plane crashed in a remote area of the Indian Ocean, far south of Australia. Due to the remoteness of the supposed crash site, search and rescue operations were virtually impossible. The theories of the plane's disappearance ranged from mechanical failure to hijacking and pilot suicide. Soon, hijacking was deemed the least likely cause, but it is known that before the plane disappeared, communication signals were manually turned off from within the vessel. The flight trajectory was also manually altered, but a logical rationale for such a sudden route change was not found. Despite extensive searches, only fragments of the supposed plane were found ashore, but the fuselage and black box have not been located to this day. There was nothing suspicious in the behavior of the pilot and crew before the flight, however. Many theories still point to the possibility of sabotage. It is also claimed that on the day of the disappearance, strange objects were noticed in the area of its supposed crash. So many now believe the plane could have been captured by an alien ship. However, despite the fact that this story has become one of the most striking in aviation history, everyone still remains in the dark about the true fate of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. When you hear about horrifying incidents with airplanes that should, at first glance, be absolutely faultless, it becomes clear why many people are still afraid to fly. Even when traveling on the most modern airplanes, you cannot be 100% sure of your safety. And this brings us to a rather disturbing story. A search operation was conducted in West Bengal to locate the remains of a plane that had fallen in the area. Although the sought-after wreckage was not found, what was discovered helped solve one of the biggest aviation mysteries that the world had puzzled over for decades. A plane that vanished without a trace 35 years ago. When it was opened, 92 skeletons were found inside. This shocking evidence suggests that the catastrophic end of this plane was due to a failed hijacking. It seems that the plane was seized by those who couldn't handle the controls, leading to disaster. This crazy discovery finally shed light on one of the biggest mysteries of aviation we've been trying to solve. However, there are still many questions about this tragic disaster that remain unanswered. Probably each of us had childhood fantasies about sneaking onto an airplane unnoticed. However, one 15-year-old boy who desperately wanted to visit his mother in Africa decided to actually do it. He ran away from home in California and climbed over the airport fence. Somehow evading detection, he chose a plane and climbed into the landing gear compartment, where he tried to hide from prying eyes during the journey. He didn't know that the plane was flying to Hawaii, not Africa, and it was probably for the best, as he barely survived the 5-hour flight. You may be wondering how a teenager managed to survive in low temperatures with extremely low oxygen levels. And the answer, confirmed by various medical specialists, is pure luck. At the end of the flight, airport workers noticed a dazed and bewildered boy emerging from the wheel well of the just-landed plane. It was unclear how he managed to endure the flight without being injured by the landing gear, as the space in the compartment is less than in a car trunk. And overall, being in it during a flight is equivalent to suddenly finding yourself at the top of Everest. The boy later admitted that he often lost consciousness during the flight. However unbelievable it sounds, he managed to survive the freezing temperatures and severe oxygen starvation. Doctors claim that he got away with it only because he was young, but he might have incurred long-term brain damage. I believe that after this story, none of you would certainly want to repeat this incredibly dangerous stunt. Known as the ghost plane, the infamous Helios Flight 522 remains one of the most shocking and unsettling aviation incidents of the 21st century to this day. For a long time, no one could understand why this tragic crash occurred on a flight that, by all accounts, should have gone perfectly normal. Here's what happened. A Boeing 737 was heading to Prague, the capital of the Czech Republic, but crashed into a mountain 2 kilometers from the village of Gramatiko and 40 kilometers north of Athens. Only 5 minutes into the flight, a warning beep about gaining altitude sounded in the cockpit. Unfortunately, the sound was identical to the takeoff configuration warning, which led the crew to completely ignore it and continue gaining altitude. Upon reaching a height of 5,400 meters above sea level, oxygen masks fell on board, and the last few tense negotiations with the pilots proved futile due to the onset of hypoxia, extreme oxygen starvation. At an altitude of 10,000 meters, the plane switched to autopilot, and everyone on board lost consciousness. Since no one from the crew responded to requests, 2 Greek F-16 fighters were dispatched to intercept the plane. Upon approach, they saw that the captain's seat was empty, and the co-pilot was likely unconscious. They witnessed a stewardess entering the cockpit, but as the plane's fuel was running out, preventing the fall was virtually impossible. All she could do was heroically steer the plane away from the city, after which it crashed into the mountains, killing all 121 people on board. This catastrophic flight marked the end of the airline's existence. To this day, it is remembered as one of the most horrific aviation disasters in history. After yet another chilling story, many of us will certainly not want to fly. The mystery of Air France Flight 447 remains one of the biggest questions in aviation to this day, and it's still one of the most horrific aviation disasters that have ever occurred. The Airbus A330, which was operating this flight, was the most advanced of all existing aircraft. It was so perfect that the likelihood of it crashing was practically ruled out until the moment it crashed. For over 2 years, no one could understand what caused this horrifying air disaster. The debris of the flight recorders was lost in the waters of the Atlantic Ocean at a depth of more than 3 kilometers, and all the experts could rely on was a set of mysterious messages transmitted from the aircraft. The obtained data indicate that the aircraft's airspeed sensors could have frozen, which, combined with adverse weather conditions, led to a fatal chain of errors that claimed the lives of all 228 people on board. The crew reacted incorrectly to the aircraft's emergency malfunction, causing the passenger flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris to enter a turbulence zone over the Atlantic Ocean, from which it could not emerge. This crash became the deadliest in the history of Air France, and also the deadliest disaster involving an Airbus A330. Despite the fact that a series of minor errors led to the aircraft's demise, this fatal accident proves that even the most high-tech aircraft today are largely dependent on the conditions in the sky, and just a few mistakes can lead to a catastrophic ending of any flight. In 1974, an event shocked the world that remains the only unsolved airplane hijacking to this day. This mystery, spanning over 50 years, has become one of the most infamous in aviation history. At the center of it was the one and only D.B. Cooper, possibly the most outstanding man who has ever lived. He boarded the plane in a business suit with a neat black tie and ordered a bourbon and soda as the plane took off from Portland. But before landing in Seattle, he seized the aircraft and demanded $200,000. Upon landing, his demands were met. But when the passengers were disembarked, the crew was forced to remain on the plane. When D.B. Cooper was the only remaining passenger on the plane, he forced the pilots to fly to Mexico, for which he had his own plans. The plane was to keep the landing gear down and not ascend above 3,000 meters. These conditions allowed D.B. Cooper to make his escape. The plane landed without D.B. Cooper on board. It is believed that he jumped from the plane, taking with him all the money, the secret of his identity, leaving a plethora of questions behind. How D.B. Cooper managed to carry out one of the greatest heists of all time, and what happened to this man, remains one of the most intriguing mysteries in aviation, and it's quite possible that we'll never get answers to it. On July 31, 1992, an Airbus A310 of Thai Airways departed for Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal. Nobody then could have imagined that this flight would become one of the most infamous in aviation history. Now, Flight 311 is both a cautionary example for pilots worldwide that anything can happen during a flight, and a warning for anyone flying over mountainous areas. Kathmandu Airport is blocked by high mountains to the north, so it can only be accessed from the south. This is one of the key details that played a huge role in the horrifying air disaster that took the lives of all 99 passengers and 14 crew members on board. Flight 311 disappeared over the Himalayas, and a few days later, debris from the plane was found several kilometers off course. Why did this flight deviate so drastically from the original route? At that time, the airport operated without radar, and due to misunderstandings between the crew and the dispatch service, the plane flew in completely the wrong direction. However, when this was noticed, it was already too late. The plane collided with a mountain peak at an altitude of 3,505 meters above sea level and was completely destroyed. All 113 people on board were killed. It took search crews 2 days to find the wreckage. A dark trail on the face of the cliff and piles of debris found at the bottom of the hillside are all that remains of the flight. Landing at any of Nepal's airports involves certain difficulties, as the country is home to some of the most challenging peaks for navigation. But the infamous Flight 311 of Thai Airways is an example of what happens when technology and human factors combine to create disaster scenarios that no one can foresee or prevent. This crash will forever remain one of the most frightening and tragic air disasters of all time. And that's all from me. If you liked this video, don't forget to rate it, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell. Your activity is the best reward for me. Thank you for your attention. See you soon. Bye.